Hi, everybody. Welcome to Practicing Care. This is Jamie Butcher. I'm an associate pastor here at First Presbyterian Church. I'm so glad you're joining us for this conversation around processing the pandemic, about finding a sacred space to think about this past year, what's going on now in 2021, and also giving ourselves some time to set intentions for this new year. So I am so excited today to be moving on to a new topic, the topic of relationships. And I'm very excited to be welcoming Reverend Katie Sundermeier. Katie Sundermeier is a well-known face around First Presbyterian Church. She is the executive director of Samaritan Counseling Center. She provides premarital counseling and pastoral counseling and loves providing pastoral counseling to those who are seeking ways to understand and process life's circumstances by integrating one's faith, doubts, and theology. So she's the perfect person to talk to us about the pandemic, our relationships with each other and with God. Katie attended Vanderbilt University, and she also has a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. Katie is Presbyterian minister. And Katie, I'm so glad you're here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us for Practicing Care.
Thank you for having me, Jamie. I love your initiative for our women's retreat this year to be breaking down different ways that we practice care within our time. And I hope and pray that each of these segments become a time where we can learn and grow ourselves and then have a time to really launch that into meaningful conversations with one another. So it is great to be here. And as Jamie asked me specifically to reflect on relationships in this time, our relationships with one another and our relationships with God, I thought of a way to make it very cohesive and clear and keep me on track was I picked 3 books that have really shaped me in these last 10 months and been very meaningful and life-giving in my journey in relationships with one another and with God, and also a little thing about seashells at the end. But the first book that I have been reading and that shapes my care for myself, that then influences the way I'm able to be in relationship with others and God, is called Trauma Stewardship. And I'll say more about that in a bit. The second book that I have been shaped by is called The Beauty in Breaking by Dr. Michelle Harper. This really has shaped the ways that I have been intentional in thinking about the relationships that I have been involved and invested in and trying to grow in. And then the third book is called The Cloud of Unknowing. There we go, a little bit closer. And this Cloud of Unknowing book, I started in September. I study this book once a month, and it's around contemplative prayer with my mother, who's in Philadelphia, one of her friends in Philadelphia, one of my best friends, her friend's daughter, who's in California, and the Sisters of Mercy in Allentown, New Jersey. So one of the beautiful things, which is really a side note, but that this year has I think opened our eyes to in a new way, is the ways that we can connect with one another far and wide. And the Cloud of Unknowing has really shaped my understanding of who God is and who God is in my life, increased my awareness of God's presence in my life and the world.
I think Katie, that's a really good way to kind of structure this big topic, which is relationships and the pandemic. So thank you. I think you're already pointing to some things we've seen that are blessings from the pandemic, like Zoom community and culture, but also we know that things were really hard around relationships in the pandemic. From the more awareness that many of us were able to receive around racial injustice and social injustice impacting relationships, to the regulations around the pandemic, whether that's social distancing or quarantining. This season has really impacted our relationships. Can you help us kind of process some of these changes by sharing what you yourself have learned about yourself in relationships during this season?
Yes. So I kind of highlighted that in the 2 books of trauma stewardship, which is really ways that I tried to make sure I was taking care of myself in this time, and then in the beauty and breaking around relationships with others. And I think it also, for me, fell into 2 categories of, in some ways, I've been able to do this, and I've walked with so many other people in this similar spaces where, for some of us, it's about different space and more time that we've had to actually think, how might I be intentional about my relationships with other people, about how I am doing myself and how I'm doing in relationship with God. And I want to say a couple of things about that. And then also, we have, at all different times in these last 10 months, some of us, some all together as a nation, as a world, some individually and in our family systems and in our other relationships, but we've been in crisis. And so that also changes the way that we are in relationship with one another. And so, and has shaped the way I've tried to journey through this time. So I want to go back first and talk about what it means that we've had more time. And we are so thankful for the vaccine and things that are rolling out. And we also know that cases continue to grow and people continue to die from COVID. So we're not post-pandemic, as we all know. And so for those of us that have not jumped in as much as we might want to about intentionally thinking about our relationships and how God might be at work in them, it's not too late. And for me, and I have had time to actually think about some of this stuff, I know how much work I still have to do. And so I'm really trying to use this time to steward, to use the book that I referenced, this time that God has given us in those ways. Because of more space and insight, time for insight into relationships, I've asked myself these 3 questions, and I invite you all to think about this in ways that you might have already been asking yourselves this, or new ways. But in my relationships, what's good? What's not good? And what do I want to change? So sometimes it's not about fixing things, or it's about, for me, it's been about acknowledging this is good, this is not good, and this is what I want to change. And if we even take it on a deeper level, I think it's about, where is God leading me to make changes? So considering really what matters to us at this time, and what are the relationships that we have that we're doing well in, or that are bringing health and wholeness and blessing, and what's not going well, and what do we want to change?
That is a huge thing to learn from this season, and that this season allowed us to think about, which is this intentionality around, or assessment of, your existing relationships. Maybe because we're not like in the press of the relationships, but we actually have a little more time and space to be more intentional. So that's super helpful. And that's from that first book. Will you mention that book again?
Yes. So the book is called Trauma Stewardship.
Okay.
An everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others.
Okay.
And I highly recommend it, because all of us are seeking to be in relationship and to care for one another. And I think the thing I would say about that, as we transition to the second part, is it's going to look different for each of us. So for me, as I was evaluating things, I realized that I needed more time for myself. I needed more time in prayer and meditation, and to process the different relationships and the different people I've been able to walk with in my work and in my personal life. And it's been around pulling back some, so that I am renewed and rejuvenated to be able to do the work I feel called and excited to do. For some people, it's motivating you to be more vulnerable, to step out there. It's going to look different for each of us. But if each of us can, with courage and grace for ourselves and love for ourselves, say, what's going well, what's not going well in our relationships, and what can we change.
Okay.
That's the invitation.
So that's a great segue to the second question, which is a little more practical. And that is, imagine we are your clients and the work you do as Samaritan. What are some tips that you would give your clients around having healthier relationships? And of course, this can carry over post-pandemic, but that would apply to this pandemic season. What are some tips you have?
Mm-hmm. So the two big things I've focused on the most are, first of all, who are the people in our lives that we are called to be in relationship with, and also who are helping us be more of in this women's retreat context, the women that God have created us to be. So in this context with Beauty and Breaking, it was actually a memoir of somebody. It's much more often in personal relationships, but a lot of times we're fed and we're helped to grow in the ways we want to grow through literature and other quote experts helping us along the way.
That's really neat. So that kind of first tip is think about the people or books or other sorts of relationships
right.
That help you become the person that you are called to be.
Right. So when we identify, if we can do the work of what's good, what's not good, what do we need to change, then what people, what groups that we're a part of, what are the ways that we spend our time? And of course, especially being in a pandemic, and there's a couple shows that I've gotten into during our time and stuff, but rather than just binge watching stuff or self-medicating or just trying to get through and we've heard this thought about how we just are trying to sleep through this. Mm-hmm. Instead, if we can think about what are our opportunities in this space, and most often, at least for me in these 10 months, it's when I've been able to find people in all of these circumstances who have read the books with me and been able to discuss them with me, who are parts of small groups and FaceTime conversations around who help me be more of who I want to be. So that's the first thing.
Yeah, and you have two, so we're waiting. What's the second one?
Yeah. The second thing that has been important, I think, for all times, but especially what we feel in a pandemic where we are in some ways more isolated and limited, is to really discern what are your gifts and what is your call. So I remember in March, and when everything was coming around, and we're such a global world now, I had so many things that I was like, yes, this is not right. I care about this. Yes, this is not right. I care about this. Oh, I want to be involved with this. Somebody has to do something about this. And a lot of times as human beings, we either then feel paralyzed and completely feel like we have to shut down, or we never feel like we're doing enough. And so a lot of times walking with someone and helping them identify, this is my call at this time in this place, and I'm going to be all in, and God is giving me a passion or a vision or something. For me, it had started a couple years ago when Pastor Chris Holmes started the Dinner and Dialogue and talking about race relations and trying to address the racism in locally and globally. But it really was able to take anchor for me in the summer. And it's a Christian study that's called Be the Bridge. And with a group of women, it's where white women and persons of color come together and go through a Christian study on racial reconciliation. And it's the first time for me in 44 years, the specific question of what am I doing to address systemic racism in our country has been very much a focus of what am I doing, whether it was just from where I'm purchasing things to what I'm saying yes to who I'm trying to include in conversations and in leadership. And that was one very important thing, but I couldn't do all the things that my heart cared about. And so I think a lot of times when we're in these spaces, one is the space of whose voices are we listening to, who is influencing us, and taking seriously our voice and the influence that we have. But then the second one is not shutting down because the world just seems so overwhelming and broken, and also, though, knowing this is my space right now, and this is where I'm going to act, and this is where I'm going to put down roots. And so those are two of the things that I help. And again, that's going to look different for everybody.
That's really great. I think that helps us acknowledge the kind of impact of the season, and also gives us hope to step forward into change, or working for justice, or working for a deeper relationship with others, a better relationship with God, in the midst of really trying times, by being able to focus on just one or two things. That's great. Those are wonderful tips. Oh, okay, Katie. Here's a big question. You're a pastor and work in the counseling world. We will have some other counseling professionals, one other pastor, but she's not currently practicing as a pastor. So you are our main voice of pastors in this Practicing Care series. And so I'm really interested in speaking specifically about you and Jesus, or you and your relationship with God. What has happened in your relationship with God during this pandemic? How has this season changed who you are with God?
Yes. Thank you for that question. I like it. And the Cloud of Unknowing is kind of centered me in that. Going back to what I had realized I needed was more rest, and so in renewal. And resting in God was where I started with worship. I got out a tradition I had years ago where I had like a journal. So every time I would live stream church or do different studies or things that were spiritually led, I would kind of journal through it and have time to pray and to quiet myself with an awareness of God's presence. I picked one little sentence for you from the Cloud of Unknowing. I loved the summary of what prayer is. When understood properly, prayer is nothing but an intense longing for God, nurturing everything good and removing anything evil. And so for me, I would say in this year, and I hope it would have happened also without all that we've had, but it's certainly intensified and been able to grow. My understanding of God's presence in my own life and work in the world has grown exponentially in this past year. And some of it's been because of such critical times and such suffering, being able to walk with people and hear their own testimony of God's miraculous intervention, of God's healing, of the hope that God's given in such dark times. I remember earlier this week, we were driving home from Philadelphia, and I just decided to send an email during prayer. I want to just say that part, the prayer thing I really loved. Grow in your own prayer life, and then pray with one another. Those are two of the things that I've always valued, but has been able to grow. And during our Stephen ministry, some of you are familiar with the Stephen ministry at our church and in all different churches and denominations, but we had different prayer partners throughout the fall training. And my last prayer partner was Tim English, a member of our church. And I just happened to send him this email on Monday morning that said, I'm praying for you, da, da, da. And I got back in 30 seconds. I just arrived to the hospital. He, as he talks about and shares within our church family, is battling cancer. And so said, I can't believe that I got this message at this time in this place. And I share the story because it reminds me that was nothing. That was on my part. That was so random. Like I was in the car. I was kind of trapped. Okay, well, what do I want to follow up on? But it was God's timing and the way that God is at work in our lives. And if we really want to know what's truly true and good, we learn that in time with God. And we also learn how to depart from evil and discern, when do we run from evil? When do we fight evil with all that is in us? And so much of that has been anchored in times of worship and prayer and spiritual growth.
Thank you.
This year for me.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear that resting in God has been spurred by the pandemic, but that is something to open to us at any time. But really, resting is a lesson in and of itself to all that can unfold around our relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And yeah, the pandemic has made us rest. So what a good way to, in many ways it has, and what a good way to connect that to our relationships with God. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that pointer. Now we're done. We're finished. We're coming to our time, but I did just want to see if there was anything else you wanted to add, anything that we haven't heard from you that you want to share on this topic of relationships.
Yes. And there are 2 short sentences, I promise. The part about our relationship with God, though, the time when I liked when you were talking, reminding me of these spaces of rest, and whether it's just reading the scriptures, whether it's reading, listening to sermons, hearing our hymns, being in worship, all of that stuff, it feels like sometimes, well, we're not doing anything. But that is where I have become so much more aware of how God is at work, and then what that prepares us for, or what even God does in that time. So I want to make sure I said that. And then you might notice I'm really into shells right now. And I even included it in my sermon at the church in the summer. But I'm like, I don't really cook or bake that well, or knit or sew or arrange awesome flowers. There's so many ways that people have showed me that they care about me in relationship during this time. And for me, it has been around shells, and whether it's a verse that I'm praying for that person, or a message that I'm praying for that person, and I just bring the shell. If you want a shell, please tell me. I would be very happy to make you a shell. But my invitation, knowing whoever's going to hear this, is what are the tangible ways that you can show that you care about somebody, and that you are praying for somebody, and that we are holding each other in our hearts. And it, again, looks different for each of us. But for me, that has been part of my spiritual discipline. It's been part of my ways of feeling connected to one another, even in this kind of crazy time. So.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you, Katie. That's always a good reminder of the ways that we can express our love to people tangibly, because what it reminds me of is central to our Christian faith, which is that God became tangible. God got incarnate to express God's love for us in Christ. So what a good calling. What a good way to conclude. Thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate your being here. And I know all the women will really appreciate your thoughts and your words on relationships during, like you said, this crazy time. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.